Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, let's understand how Next.js renders a web page onto the browser and what are the different ways to render the pages and its use cases in detail. So now let's start with understanding what is rendering in general. So rendering is the process of converting the code into usable and visual format of user interface called as web page. So rendering generates the web page and it will display on the web browser. Next.js supports both client-side rendering and server-side rendering, and there are different use cases for each type of rendering. We will discuss and explore those in this video. Let's understand what is client component in Next.js. So by default, all the components in Next.js are server-side components. So if you don't mention use client directive on top of the component page, it will by default considers like a server component. So to make it a client component, we need to use this use client directive within the component itself, and it should be the first line of the component class. Okay, so to understand what is client component, so client components are the web pages that are pre-rendered on the server during the build time, and they will be directly served to the user on the web browser when they request for it. And once for the first time when the user navigate to that particular page, the content won't change in the subsequent request to that specific page. So it is already pre-rendered on the server during the build time. So for that reason, the page will be much faster and quicker to parse and render onto the browser. And every time subsequent request when the user navigate to that particular page, so it will never go to server to render again. It will be by default parsed on the browser side itself, and it will render. So for suppose if you navigate to Gmail login page, so this particular page that you are seeing on the screen, it is common for anyone whoever log into this particular page and navigate to this particular page. So every person all over the world, whoever want to log into Gmail, they should land into this particular page. So this is common across anyone throughout the world for that reason, and there is no dynamic content in this other than the plain Google logo, as well as the sign in message and one text box and one button, and there is one more button to create the account. So this is plain HTML content. So for this type of a page to render, we no need to go to the server every time. Instead of on the first time during the build time itself, this particular page is pre-rendered on the server, and as soon as the first user try to log into Gmail, it will render this page on the client side itself, and for anyone whoever accessing this page, it will be rendered directly on the browser side instead of going to the server completely. So it is completely pure of a client side component, and for these type of scenarios we can directly use the client side component. So client side components, for the first time they will generate out of the server, and once it is passed onto the browser, it will become independent of the server, and it will be always parsed and rendered onto the browser side itself, and it will disconnect from the server, and whatever the action that is performed on the browser side, it will be parsed, and right away it is updated the browser on the browser side itself. For suppose if you see a constant like the counter, okay, so when you click a button to increase the counter, so it will, this particular type of action, to perform this action and increase the number of the count, there is no need to go to the server. It can be done only with the pure JavaScript on the browser side. So for this type of scenario, you can directly go for the client component. So now let's look at server components. So by default, Next.js components are server-side components, and unless you mention use client directive on top of the page, so by default all are server-side components. Three different ways to create the server-side components using static rendering, dynamic rendering, and streaming. These are the three types of rendering, server-side component renderings that are possible in Next.js. Now let's look at one by one in detail. So to start with, the first one is static rendering. So static rendering is very much useful for a type of a page where there is least dynamic content and maximum of static content. For example, a blog website, web page, where you see all the blog posts, and once you create a blog post, most of the time we don't even update it, we don't even change. So for a blog that has multiple blog posts to display, so there is no need for us to create a client component or any other thing other than the static rendering. So the static rendering, since it is just a plain static content, it will simply generate during the build time itself, and it will be rendered onto the browser when the user requests for it for the first time, and in the subsequent requests it will be automatically rendered only on the browser side. There is no need to go to the server, even though it is server side component, but still there is no point of going to the server since this content is of static rendering content. So for suppose if you see this particular blog, so where we have number of blogs on this particular page, okay, for suppose if you click this and see, this content won't change on daily basis. So once it is once this blog post is posted, so there is nothing is going to change unless and until if there are any corrections during when we post for the first time, we may need to make those corrections. Other than that, this content, whatever you are seeing on this particular page, this content won't change. So for this type of scenario, we have to directly go for static rendering, so that it will be rendered for the first time on the browser, on the server side during the build time, and it will be passed to the browser on the first request, and subsequent request will be directly served on the browser side itself, and there is no dynamic content, so there is no point of going to the server. So this is the use case for static rendering. So when do you use static rendering? So for suppose if there is a scenario where you have only plain static content to render onto the browser, as well as the same content is displayed to any user, whoever login request for that specific page. So for these two type of scenarios, you can go for static rendering. Advantages of static rendering are the page is going to be pre-rendered on the server. So for that reason, the faster load time will be there. When you access the page within the fraction of seconds, the page is going to be completely displayed to the user, and it will give the overall best performance and the best experience for the user whoever access this particular page. So the second one is dynamic rendering. So this is also one of the type of server component, but it is little bit different from static. So in dynamic rendering, this particular page is going to be rendered on the server, but there will be some dynamic content attached to this particular page. Let's look at the Gmail example for dynamic rendering. Or suppose if you see this particular page, so whoever logging into their Gmail account, so when they click here, they can see their own name here, and it is dynamic because this is not going to be same across different users. Since I logged in, I am able to see my name here. At the same time, whoever logging into their Gmail, they will have their own name, so which is dynamic content. So out of this whole page, all the emails or anything which is specific to a user, so for that type of for this type of scenario, we have to go for the dynamic rendering. So if there is a scenario where you want to dynamically load the portions of the page, for that type of scenario, as well as to display the content that is related to a specific user. So for these two type of scenarios, you have to go for the dynamic rendering. And advantages of dynamic rendering are it is pre-rendered on the server, and it will have a faster load time since JavaScript is parsed on the server. Whatever the dynamic content that should be added or appended to this particular page will be done on the server side. So for that reason, it will give the performance, better performance, but compare with static rendering, this is little bit slower. The third one is streaming rendering. So streaming allows the server to send to the browser a stream of HTML and JavaScript processed content to display on the page, and when the user navigate to access more content, it will be continuously streaming from the server. So that for this type of scenario, we have to use the streaming. Let's look at the Gmail example for streaming. So if you see this particular Gmail account, okay, where we have all these emails, okay, right now we are able to see around certain number of emails here on this particular first page, but when you total of 50 emails that I am seeing, when I click this older, okay, when I click this, okay, 50 more emails came and displayed on the page, okay. So on the first page load, when I log into this particular Gmail, server is going to send only the first 50 emails to display, okay. And when I click this next, that's when it will stream the leftover 50 emails from the server and send it to the browser, and it will render, okay. Again 50 more. When I click next, again it will send the 50 more emails. So this is called as streaming. So for a kind of a web page where you have if you want to display the content like this, okay, which will span across multiple pages, but you don't want to get the total content and display on the page because it will lead to the performance issues. So for that reason, we are going to just stream the data like 50 emails per page, and when you click next, it will go to the server and get the leftover 50. So for this type of scenario, you have to use streaming rendering. So when to use stream rendering? So if you have a web page where you have scenario to display only the portions of the page, and based on the user navigation or interaction with the page, you want to display more content. So for this type of scenario, you have to go for the streaming rendering.